Well, hello, Meet Tina here. How's everyone's doing? Well, today I have a very special topic that I have my guest, Hans Dietrich, to come in and talk about it. I met Hans at the Aliens event about a couple months ago, I believe, right, Hans? About a few
Yeah.
months ago in Los Angeles here. And I was planning, he was one of the speakers. I was planning to attend one of his workshop, which is Buddhist monks, relationship and connection with the Sirius star system. Well, it didn't happen. I don't know what happened that day. However, luckily he had another workshop, which was ancient symbolism. So I went in and attend, watch his talk. Amazing, amazing. But I still wanted to hear about the Buddhist monk with the Sirius connection. So here we are. Finally, we got to connect because I tried to connect with you for like what, a month now, but it didn't
Yeah.
happen. Yes. But I guess today's star is aligned. So it's about time. And let's welcome Hans Dietrich. Well, Hans, go ahead and introduce yourself a little bit about who you are, where you're from, so the audience know a little bit about you. I'm sure that
Certainly.
people know about you already in the aliens community. Yeah.
If not, they will soon.
They will, they will. I'm sure you are a growing star. You're a very good speaker. You got a lot of great information. And that's why I've invited you to come over, here on this channel and share with my audience. Well, thank you for
Excellent.
coming.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I'm Hans Dietrich. I'm a graphic designer and multimedia specialist, but I also study esoteric knowledge, ancient sites and civilizations, and occult symbology, which is the lecture that you went to at Alien Event Biomed Expo.
You got to come back and do that too. That one, I think a lot of my audience would be, wow. Yeah. What
I
you
was,
brought on. Yes.
yeah.
If we have time, if we have a
Oh,
chance.
for sure. I was a little saddened I didn't get to do my Dropa Stones lecture. I think things
Maybe one
got
day we're gonna do it too because you
things
got a
things
lot of
got double
stuff. I
booked.
mean,
Yeah.
when my speaker have something to share with the audience, that's very, very, I mean, I think it's very powerful, especially now, you know, people are so hungry for the knowledge and all this information. And yes, definitely. I love to for you to come back and share more. So let's talk about yourself. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Oh, no worries. So I grew up in South Asia. I grew up in Kathmandu, Nepal, since I was pretty much 5 years old. Graduated from the international school there. And so I was pretty immersed in the lores and legend of the area. And going to art school to get my graphic design degree, I decided to go back to Nepal for an internship in 1998. And I did a large format print internship. And then I was granted a 2-month visa for special access to Bhutan. And Bhutan, as we all know, is one of the most incredibly difficult countries to get into. You have to apply for your visa and then be selected.
Yes.
And generally, they allow 2,000 tourists a year into Bhutan. I think that's changed a little bit since the late 90s.
To be more or less people.
I think there's more now because it's
Thank
become
God.
a
You
little
know, a
a
lot of
little
people
a little
haven't
bit
heard
more
about
popular,
Bhutan. Can you
right?
believe that? Just
Because
so people don't know about it.
you have to be invited, even though you apply for a visa, you have to be invited to go, and they allow you 10 days only.
Wow.
And it's anywhere from $300 to $600 a day for your visa, which does not include room,
Um,
board, or travel within the country.
You kidding
And
me? Why so expensive?
because they don't want tourists there.
Oh my God. No wonder they preserve such an
Yeah.
ancient culture there.
And they only allow you to travel from Paro to Thimphu, which is the capital. Paro is where you land. That's where the airport is. And then from Thimphu to Boomtong. And so Boomtong is about halfway through the country. It takes about 12 hours to drive there from Thimphu, even though by way the crow flies, it's really not that far. It's about, it's a little over 100 miles.
Oh, I
it's
mean,
it's
that's one of
just it's
the,
just the roads wind and wind and wind and wind and wind until you get to the pass, and you go down the other side all the way to the river and then back all the way up and all the way down. And
would you recommend anyone to go there though? I mean, even though
oh,
it's,
of course, it's one of the most beautiful countries I've ever seen in my life.
so that's my bucket list. Yeah.
The only two embassies that they've allowed in the country are Switzerland, because in the 1950s the Swiss came in and helped
Mhm.
the Bhutanese people by starting poultry. They taught them a lot about chicken farming. Basically, they started a dairy, so there's a cheesery as well, and then they started Boomtong ale. So they did beer and schnapps. They love their schnapps, the Swiss.
Wow. That's
And
awesome.
then different apple and pear ciders they also do. And so
Wow.
this is help because there's not a lot that grows in Bhutan. I mean,
No.
most people think of where I grew up in Nepal. Oh, you're in the Himalayas. They're really amazing, but in Bhutan they're even steeper because you're closer to the Indian continental collide there, and so the mountains are incredibly steep,
Wow.
and it's next to impossible to grow anything there. And so their diet consists of what they call imidatsi, and imidatsi is probably the hottest food I've ever eaten in my life. They
Eat
go
the
and they
Thai
get
food.
even like pequins and Thai food are incredibly hot, but for some reason they get these green peppers in Bhutan, and
Wow.
that's their stable diet. They eat the green peppers, they make a
Uh-huh.
cheese fondue kind of,
Wow.
and they mix that with red rice, which is grown in Bhutan as well, and then pork fat or a chicken or a fish, and that's
Wow.
it. That's what they eat two
But I
three
bet
times a.
that's healthy over there. It's all
Oh,
natural,
for
organic
sure.
food.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
It's
Better than
just
what we got here.
it's so hot because you think you're eating green beans and you're not. You're eating green peppers.
Oh my
So
God. But you're lucky that you got a chance to, I mean, I know you grew up there and, really experience the culture, which is very ancient. So
yeah.
that's kind of cool. All right, so let's go on. A little bit about yourself, a little more. How did you
so
become, how did you end up with all this talk and, this
so my father was working in Bhutan. He worked there for 5 or 6 years. He
Mm,
taught at the Institute of Forestry, which is in far eastern Bhutan, and so this is why I got granted the special access permission. And so my thesis was on Buddhist cultural mysticism, art, and architecture. And where do I go with that?
well,
Basically,
you got invited to go over there, right?
yeah, no, I got invited to go there, but I was assigned a tutor, a translator and teacher. His name was Tashila. And so
Mm-hmm.
he took me around to all the zongs and lakongs, which are what they call their monasteries, depending on the size. The zong is a larger monastery, a lakong is a smaller monastery.
Mm,
And most of these monasteries Westerners have never been in. And some of them house some of the oldest Buddhist art that remains in the world. And so I was incredibly fortunate to go there. I did all my research around Buddhist cultural mysticism. And then one day I saw this little tiny rinky dink guy walking through Boomtong.
mm-hmm.
And I asked Tashila, who is this? And he says, oh, this is a Drokpa. And so I started getting into the research around um, the Buddhist cultural mysticism that I was studying, but then also started getting into who are the Drokpa people, these nomadic people that come into Bhutan.
Mm,
And I did my thesis, came back to the States, started my business. Didn't really think about it until a couple of years ago when I kept seeing all this reference to the Dropa stones, the Dropa stones. There's all this reference to these people and these stones that come out of what is considered now central China, but in the 30s and 40s when the story started to surface, was far eastern Kham Tibet. This place called Bayan Kara Ula and the Bayan Har Shan mountain ranges. It's pretty much where the Yangtze and Yalong rivers stem
mm,
out of, and this whole area is notorious for caves. And so I started seeing that there's this interesting overlap between the Dropa people and the Drokpa people of Bhutan.
mm-hmm.
And so that really sparked my interest. And so next thing I know, I'm going back through my notes from my thesis and realizing, wow, there's a lot more here dealing with Buddhism, especially in Bhutan, because they practice a very unique sect of Buddhism called Nyingmapa Buddhism. And this is where we get all the stories of levitating monks and ascended Tulku masters and astral projection
Wow.
and the stories of Mount Meru. And so a lot of this doesn't end up in classical Buddhist literature or verse or poems, but it is there in Nyingmapa Buddhism. And so I started learning from Tashila about ascended Tulku masters and astral projection
Mm,
and the stories around Mount Meru. And so it became really fascinating to me to start
mhm,
realizing that there's this massive connection with not just the Bhutanese people, but Buddhist cultural in general, and the star system of Sirius. They call it the brightest star that rises in the east. It's
Yeah.
connected to the dimensional portals of Mount Meru through a rainbow bridge. So this is fascinating because when you're in the high altitude in the Himalayas and even on the Tibet Plateau, at night, the Milky Way stretches across the night sky from the horizon to the tops of the mountains, and it looks like this giant cosmic rainbow. And so
Wow.
there's this interesting overlap between the two.
Now, just for the audience, you know, because I looked up Dropa, can you explain to the audience what Dropas is?
Sure. Should I get into my slideshow?
Absolutely, please do.
Yeah.
You know, the audience can just kind of follow that because I know some of the stuff may be new to some people, but a lot of my followers are into all this stuff already. You
Oh,
know,
great.
that's
Okay.
just
Yeah. Let me share my screen here.
yeah. Pretty fascinating. How did you put two and two together? Now, with all these Buddhists, they're the one from Bhutan, correct? Not from Nepal, but that's the only location that you see or you have experience with all these monks who have all this special gift, you know, like you said, levitation and all
Uh,
this.
mostly the stories come out of this Nyingma Buddhism and out of Bhutan. But even living in Nepal, I mean, you hear this. You're immersed in the Mahabharata and all
Hmm.
the Puranas and the Vedas, and they're telling some really fascinating stories as well. And then there's this other piece of literature called the Lotus Sutra, which was discovered about 100 BC, but it's much older than that. And in some of the poetic verse in the Lotus Sutra, they also talk about this connection to Sirius. And so let me
Right.
uh, let me
I
pull up
also
my.
heard from some people that up in the mountain Himalayan, there are still many ascended masters still exist, meaning still alive up
Yeah,
there.
I'm imagining there would be.
I know, right? I'm like, wow. And now listening to you, I'm like, you know what? This is possible. Definitely.
it, it is.
Cool.
And so my story goes basically around Dropa legends and lore, where I'm trying to connect the dots between the ancient secrets of Bhutan, China, Nepal, Tibet, and Sirius.
Yeah.
And so, as I mentioned, I grew up in Nepal, Kathmandu, 1981 to 1995. Nepal is a very interesting place. Lots of stuff happening there. My sister and I basically had many adventures when I was super young. My dad took us up into the village of Sikrum, where he did his doctoral dissertation in
Was
anthropology.
that you?
Yeah, that's me. I'm getting blessed by the
Wow.
king.
You are cute little boy there. Okay.
Yeah, that's the king in Nepal on the right giving me tika,
No
Bindi or tika.
way.
Yeah, so this was during Nepal New Year's. I was
Oh
probably
my God, you
five or
got that special connection with the king. That's awesome. Yeah.
6 there.
Wow.
And so this is the village that my dad did his dissertation in. It's called Sikrung. It literally hangs off of a cliff. It takes about 8 hours to hike from the riverbed at the bottom of the Manang Valley all the way to the top. My sister and I were basically the guests of honor during the Desai Harvest Festival.
Mhm.
Some scenes of some of the crazy bridges in Nepal
Wow, this
during
is
this time.
awesome though, Hans, to for you to get these pictures
Yeah,
from the past. This is amazing. Yeah.
and
Okay.
so some of the village life, and we were part of this ceremony called Desai. And so Desai takes place in the middle of September. It's their harvest festival. And because we were the guests of honor, they slaughtered a buffalo, and everybody in the village shared the buffalo, basically. Usually they slaughter a buffalo, a chicken, or a goat, depending on your wealth. The village shaman did all this magic around the buffalo, and then he pulled out this katana sword, which is interesting because katana comes from Japan.
Mm,
It was taken off of a Japanese officer in Brunei during one of the most bloody ground battles in World War II. And
mm.
these are heirlooms that are in the village. And so he did this dance around the buffalo, entranced it. The buffalo lowers his head to accept his demise, and then the shaman sacrificed him basically. And so at an early age, I was introduced to all the magic in the village basically.
Hmm.
And I was immersed in the Mahabharata and all the stories of the Yeti. It's interesting that in far eastern Tibet, the Yeti is called the Yeren, and in Bhutan, it's called the Magoi. When my father taught at Washington State University in Pullman, Washington, his office literally was next to the Bigfoot
I know, I was
expert.
gonna say that looks like Bigfoot to me here in America here,
Yeah,
right?
Grover Krantz used to, well, he's no longer with us, but he was one of the prolific Bigfoot experts. And his office was right next to my father's in the anthropology department. And
Wow.
where my dad lived in Bhutan, literally across the street from where he rented his flat was the Sokteng Wildlife Sanctuary, which is a wildlife preserve for the Magoi, basically, the Bigfoot, or
Yeah.
as they call him, the mountain man in Bhutan.
Uh-huh.
And so this took me into Bhutan, basically in 1998 to do my thesis.
Mhm.
This is the famous Tiger's Nest um, monastery, and the Tiger's Nest monastery is interesting because it burned down. It had burned to the ground the year before I got there, and so they rebuilt the entire thing. Apparently, a monk locked himself inside and burned the whole thing to the ground.
Wow.
But it literally hangs off of a cliff. It's like one of the craziest monasteries I've ever been to.
Wow. Okay.
But here I am, doing my studies, basically at the monasteries. The one on the left is called Jokar Monastery, and that's where I did a lot of my studies. And so the gentleman in the middle down at the bottom is my teacher, Tashila. And so the monk is translating to him, and then he's translating in Nepalese and English to me, and I'm taking my notes on
That's amazing.
all the
Impressive.
different tanka and wall paintings. And so this is what you see on some of the walls there.
Yes.
The lower pieces are new pieces that students had done recently, but the upper piece and the piece on the right was stuff that was on the walls. And so I was taken into 3 rooms. And the first of the 3 rooms was what they called the forbidden room. And so this is what the Jokar Zong looks like. All the walls were painted black, except for these highlights around different characters. And they called it the forbidden room because they actually wouldn't let women go in this room, although there aren't a lot of women in the monasteries anyway.
Right.
The walls depict demons eating people, demons having sex with people, the sacred Kama Sutra. The stories of Mount Meru and the gifts from Sirius from Mount Meru are on the walls, as well as Ascended Tulku Masters and the Ascended Tulku Masters of Sirius. And so I was taken into a second room, which was the room of the meditator. And this picture on the right of Shiva actually comes out of that room, the room of the meditator. And so the room of the meditator is basically a room depicting Shiva or Milarepa or Siddhartha Sakyamuni performing every duty that a human can go through. So he's depicted as a farmer, he's depicted as a lover, a father, a fisherman, you name it. And so I learned the stories around Shiva, Milarepa, Siddhartha, as well as Drokpa Gyaltsen, Muhammad Galgiana, and Gadgad Savara of Sirius. And people think, oh, Shiva's not, he's not considered a Buddhist deity, but in fact he is, because where does Shiva live? He lives on Mount Meru or Mount Kailash, which is in the middle of Tibet, and so there's this crossover between Hindu deity and the Buddhist belief. And so, yeah, this was the character I saw walking up the street. This guy's about 4 foot tall. He has this orangish skin, blue eyes, which is incredibly rare for this region.
That's interesting. Blue eye looking like that. Yes.
Yeah. They wear this felted wool spider cap with these tendrils that stick off of it. So this helps wick moisture out of their face when they're in the fogs of the high passes or during the monsoon rains. And then he's wearing his leather apron where the fur is inverted on the inside and the tanned leather is on the outside. And this is usually either goat or yak. And he doesn't speak Nepalese or Bhutanese or Tibetan. He speaks this very rare dialogue called Shina. And so I had asked basically, who is this?
Yeah.
And so I was taken into the third room in the Jokar Zong, which shows a depiction of the first Druk Gyalpo, which is the Dragon King of Bhutan. His name was Irgun Wanchu, but he also had a Dropa or Drokpa name, which was Deb Nag Po. And so in Hindu and Buddhist belief, a Nag is a snake deity. It's usually the body of a snake with the torso of a human. And so Deb Nag Po roughly translates to flying serpent king, where Druk Gyalpo is also the flying dragon or cloud dragon. Druk in the Buddhist language or Bhutanese language means cloud dragon. And so Drokpa means the people of the cloud dragon, which is interesting.
Yeah, I will ask you about the dragons, the story of the dragon too. Why there's so much dragons,
That's
symbology?
a
Yeah.
that's a good question. Yeah, and especially in Bhutan, because the name of Bhutan, I mean, we call it Bhutan in the West, but it's actually Druk, and Druk means the cloud dragon, and so this is the land of the cloud dragons, and
Wow.
it's interesting why this comes out. Anyway, so he
Yes.
shows me this wall painting. This painting is probably, I would say, 15 feet or 5 meters across by
Wow.
about equally as tall. And in the procession of gifts for Urgenwanchu is this Dropa or Drokpa character. And it's interesting because he's carrying two of the gifts that came supposedly from Sirius and were found on Mount Meru. One of them is the singing bowl. I have one here that,
The singing bowl, right? You mentioned.
yeah,
Okay.
singing bowl. And the other one, and inside of the singing bowl is the Sintamani stone, which looks something similar to this, except it's out of Moldavite, which is a meteoric glass, and is said to have come from Sirius. I'll get into the story around
So it's
that
multiply. Oh my God. Okay.
yeah, shortly.
Yes, please.
So I started asking, about the Drokpa people, and so this is what they look like. They have incredibly rich blue eyes, which is so rare. I mean, Tibetans don't
That's
have blue eyes, Nepalese don't have blue eyes,
no.
Chinese
Never
don't
seen
have blue
one.
eyes. And
No,
so
none
where
of
did
the Asian, unless they're mixture, but it,
right? And so
every
where does
single one has that. That's very uncommon. Yes.
yeah. So the question is, where does this trait come from? And it's interesting. And so my mom is in this picture on the right. She's 5'4", and so sitting down, the woman standing next to her is probably about 4 feet tall.
Wow.
These people are not very tall, but they were instrumental in bringing not only Nyingma Buddhism to Bhutan, but also starting and establishing the kingdom of Bhutan.
Wow.
Um,
Okay.
as I said, they come out of far eastern Tibet, Kham Tibet, basically, which is now central China.
Yeah.
There's a transliteration with their name. So in 1950, the Chinese invaded Tibet and forced a lot of the village people that were there into either becoming nomads, or they were forced into India and Bhutan.
And do you know, Hans, that Tibet, uh, according to the Earth chakra, is a seven chakra.
Oh
That's
wow, okay,
yes, it's the crown chakra, or the chakra of enlightenment.
interesting, because this is where
Yes.
the story of Mount Meru comes into play. So I say,
Wow. Okay, this is getting good.
yeah, I say transliteration. Transliteration for your audience is basically a game of intellectual telephone.
Yeah.
Um, you're taking what you hear from one language and you're trying to transcribe it into your own language so that others understand what you heard.
Mhm.
And so in far eastern Kham Tibet, the Drokpa were known as the Dropa. As you go through Tibet, this changes a little bit and it becomes the Zopa, kind of
Mhm.
like Zong in Bhutan. Then when you get into Bhutan, Nepal, northern India, and kind of into Ladakh, they're known as the Drokpa.
Yes.
And the further west you go toward the Caspian Sea and Black Sea area, they're known as the Brokpa. And it's
Mm.
interesting because the Taltosh in, I believe, Romania, the shaman there are very related to the shamanistic practices of Nepal. And so there's a question as to whether, this nomadic migration has brought a lot of basically Asian influence into that portion of Europe.
I believe that because some of them do look like Asian or half. Yes.
Right. So they speak this language called Shina, and so this is the different depictions of the languages of the area. In the upper left is Proto-Chinese and Chinese glyphs. In the upper right is Kham Tibetan writing, as an example. Underneath that is Sanskrit.
Yeah.
The lower left is a spiraling Tibetan writing, and then on the lower right is this language called Shina. And
Mm.
there are three different forms of Shina. There's Shina Brokskat, Shina Brokat, and Shina Minoriskat. And this language predates Sanskrit by 2,000 to 3,000 years. So it literally is one of the oldest spoken languages in the region. It's a gendered language like Thai, so it has a male and female voice
Ah,
to
you
it.
know about that too, huh? Uh-huh.
It also is hierarchical. So there's a child's tongue, there's a common tongue, and then there's the royal tongue.
Mm.
And so it's interesting because this is very different from other languages in the region. I
Yes.
mean, Thai language is not necessarily in this region, but the
Mhm.
Thai and Spanish languages are both gendered languages, and
Yes.
so it's
Yes, they
it's
are.
it's it's interesting to see this connection
Wow.
as well. And so this kind of led me into my studies around Mount Meru because this topic kept coming up. Well, what is Mount Meru and what does it have to do with these people? And so Mount Meru is interesting because it is a physical mountain. This is actually Mount Meru on the right. It exists on the border between Ladakh and Tibet in far western, northwestern Tibet. But it's also known as a dimensional portal.
Mm.
And by that, I mean, it stems from the root chakra of Shambala or Shangri-La deep in the earth. That's where the root chakra is. And then it goes through the 7 chakras all the way to the crown. And you were saying that Tibet is
Wow,
considered.
I just shared that with you. Yes.
Right. Okay.
I didn't know
And,
about Shambhala, so now you brought it up. And I knew that the Tibet is a 7 chakras portal. It's a portal.
right.
And when there's a portal, there's always the UFO and ETs.
Other activities, and
Yeah,
this is where the Yeti comes from as well. And there's a thought that Bigfoot and the Yeti are also considered extraterrestrial of sorts.
I believe that. Wow. Okay.
And so each layer of Mount Meru is a different chakra, and each layer is inhabited by different beings that are in that density, basically,
Mm.
until you get to the summit. And the summit is then said to connect to the star system of Sirius, the brightest star that rises in the east, through a rainbow bridge. And so this depiction on the right is showing this rainbow connection between the
Hmm.
earthly realms and the realms of Sirius. And as legend goes, which my teacher Tashila told me, about 20,000 years ago, a box is found on top of Mount Meru that
Hmm.
houses these 4 items. And the 4 items are the Sintamani stone, which is a piece of meteorite from Sirius and is said to grant its possessor with long life and prosperity.
Mm.
The second item in the box is called the Vajra Dorje, and it's a 4-sided lightning bolt. Hold on, I actually have one on my shelf.
No way. You have one? Where'd you get that one from?
I bought it when I was overseas the last time.
All
Usually
right.
you see the Dorje like this, where it's just 2-sided. This is considered a lightning bolt, but the Vajra Dorje is
Mhm.
4-sided.
I know.
And
Where'd you get
so
that one? That's the one I want. I'm sure
it
my audience gonna want to find out where you get it.
right.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
I bought this in Nepal the last time I was there. So yeah.
Oh
The
boy.
Vajra Dorje represents the 4 winds or the 4 elements
Yeah.
basically that make up Vajrayana Buddhism. So then the third item in the box is Buddha's singing bowl, right? And it's, Buddha's singing bowl, where
Yes.
when it's strummed and oscillated, it creates to the meditator a transcendental meditation. So they go into a transcendental state of meditation.
That's why the singing bowl has been so popular, in the
Right.
past, 10, 20 years now.
And
Yes.
then the last item in the box is called the Omani stone, and it's usually either a stone that has writing around it. I have one on my shelf as well, or it's a circular disc that has the mantra Om Mani Padme Hum written upon it. And this is what the Buddhist monks will chant over and over and over again, usually 108 times or more. Om Mani Padme Hum, Om Mani Padme Hum, as they're
Yeah.
using their mani beads and they're walking around doing their prayers.
Uh-huh.
But Om Mani Padme Hum translates to the jewel within the sacred lotus. And so if the lotus is the crown chakra, then the
Yes.
jewel in the lotus is your pineal gland or your seat of consciousness.
Oh my Lord. I was just thinking about that. Must be a pineal gland, and you just said it, Hans. That's amazing. Yes.
And what's interesting about both the crown chakra and the pineal gland is the crown chakra is representational of as the lotus. And the lotus flower grows out of the mud. And within the lotus flower, you can find trace amounts of DMT or dimethyltryptamine, which
Yeah.
also is processed in your pineal gland. And this is
Yeah.
what takes you into transcendental meditation. This takes you into the dream state.
Yeah.
And so if these monks are chanting and using the bowls correctly, they will go into a state of trance, which is incredibly fascinating. And
Wow.
so this is what Om Mani Padme Hum represents. But the most fascinating item in this box is the Sintamani stone. It's basically known as the luck stone, the wish-fulfilling jewel, the dream stone from Sirius. It's been sought after by empires, religious people, and mystics.
Mm-hmm.
Nicholas Roerich in the early 1920s was in Tibet trying to find it, as was Madame Blavatsky, another esoteric researcher of that time, a theosophist, as was
So
Alice
let me.
Bailey and Alexandria Neal. And so they were all looking for the entrance to Shambhala and the Sintamani stone. In Leonardo da Vinci's famous Salvator Mundi,
Yeah.
his portrait of Jesus, he's holding the Sintamani stone in his hand, which da Vinci had called the philosopher's stone. And so for the alchemists in your audience, the philosopher's stone also gives you longevity of life and
So
prosperity.
now, can I ask you a question about these stones?
Yes.
Because everybody look for it, so which means it's quite rare, right?
Very rare. Yes.
And they are on these pictures that you have it on screen right now.
Yes. This is how it's represented in different cultures. And so in Islam, it's known as the Kaaba stone.
Kaaba
And so
stone.
the Kaaba sits in Mecca. It's a black cube building.
Mm-hmm.
And in its eastern corner, in this silver yoni, as you see here, is this Kaaba stone. And it's a piece of meteorite that fell from Sirius, according to Muslim tradition and legend, during the Hajj. And the Hajj takes place at the end of July, early August, when Sirius rises along with Canis Major above the horizon and is actually seen. And so this is the most sacred time for the pilgrims to come once in their lifetime to Mecca and go around the Kaaba building and then eventually come up and touch the Kaaba stone. And what's fascinating about that is the Kaaba building is a representation of Saturn.
Oh,
the silver yoni is a representation of the goddess, and the Kaaba stone itself is a representation of Sirius. So you have Saturnian, goddess, and Sirius symbology all represented in one place.
Wow.
So to the Buddhists, it resides in the city of Shambhala with the great Buddha, the head of the Great White Brotherhood, or the Brotherhood of Light, as it's depicted here. The great Buddha is holding it. And in China, it's interesting that it is sitting underneath the paws of the Fu dogs, which protect the sacred forbidden city, basically, while it's wrapped in the flower of life symbology, and it's known as the luck stone. And it's interesting that there's always this connection with the star system of Sirius and dogs.
Yes. Why is that?
In China, they call it the Tsingao. It's this black dog that comes during the time of eclipses and eats the sun. There's the dog days of summer. I mean, this is when Sirius comes out, is during the dog days of summer. In Tibet, there's also the Tibetan year of the Tibetan dog, which is every 50 years is another cycle of this Sirius mentality situation. And so it's revered as the dog star, and it's really interesting. I mean, you even look at the logo for Sirius FM or Sirius TV, it's a dog, and the eye of the dog is a star. And so for some reason, this knowledge of the dog star, has been passed down through different cultures, and it represents Sirius. But we also find the Sintamani stone in Hollywood. So in the movie Wonder Woman 1984, I like to reference a lot of movies, by the way.
Oh my God, yes, because
so your audience
they're
knows.
true. Yes, they know about it too. Yes.
So it was called the Dream Stone, and when Max Lord crushes it and he absorbs its power, he becomes what is known in Buddhism as Sintamani Loksavara, the embodiment of the Sintamani stone and its power. And this is a representation, this statue on the right of Sintamani Loksavara. And so this got me into the next part of my research, which took me into ascended Tulku masters of Sirius. And so what is an ascended Tulku master? Well, an ascended Tulku master is somebody that, somebody that has reached the prowess of mind, body, and spirit. They have mastered the spiritual meditational technology of astral projection, and it is a technology. It's not nuts and bolts like your car, but it's considered a technology because as you practice it over and over and over again, it becomes, a more of a realistic situation. And basically, they also are known as the bodhisattvas. And so they attain enlightenment within one lifetime, they reach a state of nirvana, But instead of going into their light body and, ascending through the heavens, they decide to stay on Earth basically to help others through compassion go through their suffering. And so we see ascended Tolkien masters in movies. So in the movie Doctor Strange, and Astral Projection for that matter, we have the ascended Tolkien master of the Ancient One force pushing Stephen Strange's astral body out of his physical body. And in the blink of an eye, she shows him the horrors and the beauty of the multiverse or the astral plane, and then brings him right back into consciousness because he is not initiated to be there, and therefore could lose his mind, body, and soul in the astral plane and not be able to ever come back.
Wow.
We see another version of this in Star Wars The Last Jedi. Everybody dislikes this movie, but there's quite a bit of esoteric knowledge in it. And so at the end, Luke Skywalker is staring into the twin setting suns. Keep in mind that Sirius is a binary star system, so it has twin suns as well. Mm-hmm. This is a theme that pops up a lot in Star Wars, the twin suns. And he projects himself, his consciousness, and his physical form halfway across the galaxy from Ahch-To to the planet of Crate, where he confronts his nephew, Kylo Ren or Ben Solo, one last time. And this depletes his energy. We don't see him dying. We see him disappearing, as you're seeing here on screen, into the setting sun. And this is interesting because this is a philosophy that actually comes out of ancient Kemet or ancient Egypt. And it's called westing. So instead of actually dying, you go into the west where the sun sets, and then you are reborn again through the next cycle of life.
Yeah.
After you go through the duat, which is the nighttime, and you shed your 9 souls, then you come back again.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting that we have this, both Buddhist and ancient Cometian concept happening in this movie. And then eventually, they all end up as light bodies, like you see at the end of Return of the Jedi, where they are now ascended masters. We also see Merkaba technology, which is what I was describing a little bit earlier. The Merkaba is interesting because it's considered a tetrahedron. So it's a pyramid, but instead of having 4 sides and a base, it has 3 sides and a base. So all sides are equilateral triangles.
Yep.
And then it flips inside of itself, and another one sits on top of it, making, I guess we would call the Star of David, or a hexagram, basically. And one tetrahedron is spinning one direction, and the other is spinning the other direction, and it creates an energy field in the middle that is what becomes the astral projection. Basically, that is the technology. And so we find this in the movies as well. In the movie The Fountain, we have this character Tommy who goes into the. It's a 3-phase movie, so it starts in the present, but there's a story that deals with the conquistadors looking for the Fountain of Youth and the Tree of Life, and then it ends up in the future. And so Tommy finds the Fountain of Youth, spoilers, of course, and he drinks the sap from the tree of life, and he has a physical death. But through his physical death, he comes back as a light being who is tasked to astral project through the cosmos to a stellar nursery at the base of Orion's belt. And it's interesting because the 3 stars of Orion point to Sirius on the horizon. And right underneath Orion's belt is a stellar nursery. And to the ancient Mayan culture, this was called Shabolba. It was their underworld. And it's interesting that Shabolba and Shambala are very similar.
Yes. Yeah, I was going to say that. Yeah. Well.
And so this is more of a etheric, version of astral projection using the Merkaba spiritual meditational technology. In the movie The Last Mimsy, which is a beautiful movie, it was basically for children, but it also has, quite a bit of an aspect for adults. These 2 children, a boy and a girl, find these items on a beach and discover that they have the power to activate these items. One of them is a bunch of stones. Another one looks like a cell phone, but isn't. It's like a piece of glass, but basically it allows the young boy to send things dimensionally across the room or across a field. And then the third item in the box is Mimsy, this stuffed animal. And so they realize that they have to send Mimsy back to the future. And so Mimsy is carrying the DNA of the young girl's love to the future, where we have lost humanity and we have lost our ability to love. And so
Wow.
it's the last Mimsy because they're sending the last one. They don't have the technology to send any more back, in hopes that a child will fall in love with it and send back her DNA or his DNA back to the future. Mimsy is also the character in Alice in the Looking Glass, which was I think it followed Alice in Wonderland, but was more of the esoteric story around it. And so
Right.
this is the rabbit in Alice in Wonderland as well. And so the young boy creates this Merkaba field. The rabbit goes into the Merkaba field, and then it's shot into the future to help humanity in the future.
Wow.
In Star Wars, The Empire Strikes Back, we have a very physical Merkaba, and this is Darth Vader's meditational chamber, which we see.
Mm-hmm.
And so in this chamber, because the chamber creates this energy field, he has the ability to take off his helmet to heal his wounds, and he also can then basically through telepresence connects across the universe with the Emperor and his son Luke Skywalker, and that's a very physical form of the Merkaba. And so this then got me into, well, who are the ascended Tulku masters of Sirius?
Yes.
So,
Yes. Good question there. Boy.
so the first comes out of Bhutan. His name is Drokpa Gyaltsen. Drokpa, again, is a transliteration of Drokpa or Dropa. Drokpa Gyaltsen was known to go into deep states of meditation,
Mm-hmm.
where he could then levitate himself and his ritual instruments. On the right, he's depicted in 3 different forms of meditation, and at the top, you see him in meditation riding atop a rainbow toward the east.
Mm-hmm.
So he is riding from Mount Meru toward the brightest star that rises in the east, the star
Mm-hmm.
of Sirius. And in Timsing Monastery, which is in far eastern Bhutan, the monks will go into the Holy of Holies to meditate. It's a room that's probably about 15 or 20 feet, squared.
Mm-hmm.
It's pitch black in there except for some butter lamps, because the art on the wall is so old that if you shine light on it, it will crack and fade out,
Wow.
basically. So they keep this room incredibly dark.
Mm-hmm.
And as you see, he's wearing this incredibly heavy piece of chainmail that has spikes on the end of it. And so this kind of acts like a Faraday cage to keep his soul and his spirit together while he meditates.
Wow.
And so eventually he will sit down on the floor in the room. He will stake the chainmail into the ground, so he can then go into a deep state of transcendental meditation and learn to be an initiate to astral project across the astral plane to other dimensions, planets, stars, universes. I mean, this is what astral projection brings about. And so this is Drokpa Gyaltsen. He was the first ascended Tulku master that I learned about when I was in Bhutan.
Mm.
The second one is Mohamed Galgiana. And Mohamed Galgiana is interesting because he comes to us from the Lotus Sutra, this book that was discovered about 100 BC, but is much older. And it's beautiful poetic verse, but it's all in poetry. And so you have to read between the lines to really understand what the story is that's being told.
And that looks like a Merkaba there, right?
Correct. And so he's sitting in the Merkaba energy.
Yeah.
One day, he is a disciple of Sakyamuni, who we know of in the West as Siddhartha. And sadly, we're told in the West that Siddhartha was the first Buddha. Well, this is not true. Siddhartha was probably the 1,000th reincarnate of the first Buddha. But he was known as the first Bodhisattva because through compassion, he stayed to help people through suffering. That was his main purpose. And so this is why he's revered as the first Buddha. But in fact, he's mostly the first Bodhisattva. But he's also known as Sakyamuni. And so Mohamed Galgiana was a disciple of Sakyamuni. And one day he wants to go into deep meditation and ascend the dimensional portal of Mount Meru to see if he can hear the beautiful voice of the great Buddha from the summit. And so he ascends through the dimensions of time and space to the summit of Mount Meru, and he hears Sakyamuni's beautiful voice. And so he asks Sakyamuni, hey, can I have the permission and the technology to cross the rainbow bridge to the dimensional portal or to the astral world of Sirius? And so Sakyamuni grants him the permission and the technology and technique to do so. And so Mohamed Galgiana crosses the dimensions of time and space and ends up at Sirius, where he is confronted by a race of giants who think he is a small bug to be crushed. And it's interesting because Eventually, one of their bodhisattvas, one of their Buddhas, recognizes him as a disciple of Sakyamuni, asks forgiveness, and then asks, would you meditate with us before you return to the earthly realm, which he does. When he returns, he's granted the title of bodhisattva because he's reached this incredible state of enlightenment and astral projection. And as an ascended Tolkien master, this is, his next right. He was known to be able to fly and to also anthropomorphically shapeshift into other creatures and animals. And so that is the story behind Mohamed Ibrahim. But the most fascinating of the three ascended Tolkien masters of Sirius that I learned about is this character here, and his name is Gadgad Savara. And so Gadgad Savara comes to us from the Lotus Sutra as well. It's either chapter 23 or chapter 24. And the chapter goes like this. Manjusri, who is also a disciple of Sakyamuni, is in meditation one day. And he is in the astral realm of meditation. And he is visited by this character named Gadgad Savara, who is glowing orange skin, blue within blue eyes. And he doesn't believe what he's seeing because he thinks he's in a deep state of trance, basically. And his mind is creating these visions of this person. And Gadgad Savara says, no, I'm a real person, and I will prove it to you. I will leave you 7 jeweled lotuses that you will discover when you come out of your meditation. And so Manjusri comes out of his meditation, and he's surrounded by these 7 jeweled lotuses, and he freaks out. He's like, how is this possible? And so he goes to Sakyamuni, and he asks Sakyamuni, who is Gadgad Savara, and how does he have the ability to meet me on the astral plane? And Sakyamuni says, well, Gadgad Savara is a sage. He's a bodhisattva that has come to us from the brightest star that rises in the east, the star of Sirius. And he has mastered the meditational spiritual technology of astral projection. And therefore, he is able to meet you on the astral plane. And so Manjusri asks Sakyamuni, well, how can I learn this technique? How can I meet with Gadgad Savara again on the astral plane? And so Sakyamuni says, well, you're not initiated. This is where that initiation from Dr. Strange comes into play. You're not initiated yet. So we will have to have another initiated monk guide you through the techniques into the astral plane, into a deep state of meditation, so that you can then meet with Gadgad Savara. And so Manjusri says, okay. And he is taught this technique. He goes into a deep state of meditation, and he ends up on the astral plane and meeting with Gadgad Savara. And he challenges Gadgad Savara. He says, do you have the ability to come visit us in the earthly realm in your physical form? And Gadgad Savara says, yes. And then it is said that he climbs atop his flying palace, a tower of 7 layers. Here's your Mount Meru experience. And accompanied by the sounds of hundreds of thousands of musical instruments being played without players, which is the scene you're seeing on the screen here. He's standing with all these musicians. So accompanied by the sounds of musical instruments, basically playing without players, he travels across the dimensions of time and space and arrives in the atmosphere around Earth. He comes down through the clouds, descends from his tall tower, and he meets with Manjusri and Sakyamuni and their disciples.
Wow.
He blesses the earth. He says, wow, this is such a beautiful place. Unlike the Saha, or mundane realm where I come from at Sirius, which was destroyed by an ancient war and was left as mud, filth, rocks, and mountains. They then all meditate together. Gadgad Savara, bids everybody farewell, again climbs atop his flying palace, his Vimana, his tower of 7 layers, this, Mount Meru experience, and once again, accompanied by the sounds of hundreds of thousands of musical instruments, he transports across the dimensions of time and space back to Sirius.
Wow.
What is this depicting? This is depicting an extraterrestrial visitation.
Yes, of course. Yes.
The flying palace, the tall tower, this is a spaceship of sorts. The noise that accompanies it is the noise of the repulsor lifts coming down through the clouds. I mean, it's a cacophony of noise, and the only way they could describe it in this poetry is it sounded like hundreds of thousands of musical instruments being played, but we don't see the players, so something's playing the instruments. And it's interesting because we have a depiction of this very similarly in the Solo, a Star Wars story, with Dryden Voss's tower ship, which is also a tower of 7 layers that comes down from the clouds and has a cacophony of noise surrounding it. And so it's interesting because this is where the Sirius, story of Buddhism crosses over into the Dropa legends and lore. And so, without further ado, who are the Dropa? Well, I kind of explained that they're this nomadic group of people that came out of far eastern Kham Tibet. But what is their story? Why is this so fascinating to, the UFO crowd and those who are researching into aliens?
Yeah.
Well, I decided to do some research and discover the origins of this story. Because if you look online, the story on Wikipedia and on everybody's blog posts is the same story repeated over and over and over and over again. And so I thought there's got to be something more to this, because the story itself isn't very deep or in depth. And so I started researching into the origins of where this story actually came from. And so in December of 2004, episode 15 of the UFO Files, this is where this story came out of. And so we have 3 researchers in this documentary. Richard Dolan, who's pretty well known in the UFO field these days.
Mm-hmm.
David Sereda, who worked for a small time at NASA. He was a NASA scientist for a while.
Mm-hmm.
And this character, Hartwig Hausdorff, who wrote the book, The Chinese Roswell.
Mm.
And so they tell this story that comes out of 1938 out of China. Well, actually, it comes out of Tibet, this area right behind us here.
Yeah.
And so the story goes like this. In 1938, a cultural archaeologist and anthropologist named Chipute and his team adventure into the Bayan Kara Ula around Bayan Harshan, which is one of the mountains there, looking for archaeological sites. And as I had mentioned, this area is full of caves and cave systems, very similar to the cave systems that you find in Dolpo on the border of Nepal and Tibet at very high altitudes. These caves are incredibly old. They often will have artifacts in them, ancient artifacts. They will have scrolls or documentation also in them. Petroglyphs have been found on the walls, and they also have had mummies found in them.
Wow.
And because of the arid climate of this region, the mummies are very well preserved. And the mummies are like the Tarim mummies, which they believe are 4,000 or 5,000 from 4,000 or 5,000 BC. And these also depict, these orange leathered skinned people with auburn hair and blue or green eyes. And so it's quite fascinating. Anyway, in the back of the cave, inside of the cave, inside of the cave systems, they find a cave where the walls, the ceiling, and the floor are hewn out of the bedrock with sheer flat precision, similar to other caves that you find in the region. What's fascinating about this region is it's about 100 kilometers west of where the Shangxingdui culture comes from. And it's interesting because if you look at the artifacts from this culture, they look very alien.
Yes.
They do not represent a lot of what you find in China. It's quite fascinating. And about 150 kilometers to the southeast is where you find all the pyramids of China, as well as the terracotta warriors and the first emperor of China, who is buried with terracotta warriors in a pool of mercury. And so it's fascinating that these two cultures come out of this region. But getting back to the caves, so this is kind of what the caves look like in Dolpo. They're cut out of the bedrock. They're about 14,000 plus years old, and they basically found Buddhist manuscripts in them. They found other artifacts. On the right is this 4,000 plus year old weathered Tarim mummy that comes from this region as well. She has blue eyes and this leathered orangish yellow skin.
Wow. And
the walls of this cave are very similar to this cave that we find in Peru in the middle of nowhere. It's like way up on this cliffside, where my good friend, researcher Brien Foerester here is seated in the sunken false doorway. But this cave of Napa Iglesia, Napa Waka, is cut out of the bedrock completely. It has 90-degree angles. It's tabletop flat. It has a tolerance of about 1/100th to 1/500th of an inch. The human hand is not this stable to be able to not only cut this, but polish it down to that level of tolerance. And this is very similar to caves that we find in India, like the Barbara caves, which are also completely hewn out of the bedrock with, mirror finish polishing within them. And in this particular cave, a perfect half dome ceiling. And so
Wow.
again, how are these being made? We don't have a clue how these are being made.
Right. Yeah.
So back to the story. On one of the walls is petroglyphic art showing the sun and the moon, the star system of Canis Major, with Sirius being its brightest star. Canis Major is the dog constellation, which is again why Sirius is in representation of the dog star.
Right.
And there's a star path or dotted path that leads to what looks like a mountain range. At the back of the cave, they find the remains of row upon row of both mummified and skeletal remains of very short and statured people with slightly elongated skulls. Hartmut Hausdorff calls them large, clumsy skulls, but they're not. And of the mummified remains, they're realizing that these short people have blue eyes and this orangish skin. Again, this trait that keeps coming back around. Toward the back of the cave, with the bodies, they discover a singular disc, and on this disc is written a glyphic writing that is unfamiliar to Chipute and his team. And the disc is about a foot wide. It has a hole in the center and glyphic writing spiraling out from the middle. Very similar to this. This is a Chinese Bai disc, but this is super old. The glyphic writing on this is in Proto-Chinese language. And this is made out of jade. And so I have had this in my collection for many, many years. But they don't really know what the Bai discs were used for. They found them in burials. At the back of the cave, this is my depiction, by the way, of what I think this Dropa stone actually looks like. At the back of the cave, they unearth about 716 other stone discs, but we don't know from the story if there's any writing on them. We only know the one stone. And it's interesting because in a lot of these Chinese burials, like the one on the right, you will find hundreds of these discs that are just flat. They don't have any writing on them, as depicted here on the right. And so it's interesting because they decide to then collect as much material as they can, and then they return to the Beijing Academy of Sciences in Beijing to do further analysis on.
Now, Hans, you noticed this disc. You notice the pattern that go around like how sacred geometry.
Yes.
Right? Like how you see in the shells and everything. But it's in symbol. Yeah.
Yes, it's in symbol, correct.
What I'm amazed to is they're being mummified just like in Egypt.
Well, they're not mummified as in they're wrapped. They're mummified because of the arid climate. It's so dry and there's no moisture that these burials will just dry out, and so then the remains are left like a mummy, pretty much.
Okay, got it.
In 1958, another professor at the Beijing Academy of Sciences in the prehistory department named Sung Un-Nui deciphers the glyphic writing on the disc. And he claims that around 10,000 BC, a group of people known as the Dropa came here from Sirius and crash landed. And the burial was a burial for them as the people.
Wow.
Shortly after this, one of the discs makes its way to the Soviet Union. Sung Nui reports his findings, and he's literally laughed out of the university because they think he's ridiculous talking about an extraterrestrial race coming here and that he deciphered the glyphs on the disc. And so he is said to have fled to Japan in the early 60s. Around this time, one of these discs ends up in the Soviet Union, in Russia, for further analysis. And so what they do is they take mineral samples from it and they do quantum harmonic oscillation testing on it. And it's interesting because in the documentary, they're laughing that they must have put this thing on a turntable, and played it to find out if, it was oscillating at all. But in reality, what they would have done was they would have attached electrodes to it and pulsed it with electricity to see if it resonated and held a charge. And so what's interesting is my disc here is jade, which is a very soapy stone. But the mineral tests from the disc that was sent to the Soviet Union came back as jadeite. And so jadeite is a type of granite. It's a lot harder, but it has jade crystal infused within it. And oftentimes will also have cobalt and mercury infused within it. And so when they did the quantum harmonic oscillation tests, they realized that it was holding a charge and that it had been around massive amounts of electricity at some point in its history. And so this is a huge mystery. Was this part of their ship? Who knows? Okay.
Wow, that's amazing. Yeah.
So then these researchers say that this story came out of 3 publications from 1962. By the way, in 1950, it was when the Chinese invaded Tibet. And in 1966 is when Mao started his Cultural Revolution, which lasted 10 years. And sadly, a lot of China's prehistory was either destroyed, ended up in private collections, or was smuggled out of the country. And only recently has some of it started showing back up in museums, which it's incredibly sad that this even happened. Wow. But we're told that in 1962, this story of the Dropa and of Chipute and Sulanui came out of 3 publications. The first publication being Das Vegetarische Universum, or the Vegetarian Universe, from 1962. The second is the Belgium UFO Bulletin from 1962. And the third is Sputnik Magazine, very popular magazine in the Soviet Union, from 1962. And we're also told that it's in the first edition of Chariots of the Gods by Erich von Däniken. And so this is where I decided I'm going to start my research, because basically we're being told that this story comes out of these publications. Well, I have hunted high and low, and I have not found a single edition or publication of Vegetarian Universe, period. It doesn't exist in the research that I've discovered. Nor have I found the Belgian UFO Bulletin from 1962 either. This doesn't exist either. And Sputnik has an amazing online archive from the 1960s onward. And so all of their magazines have been digitized in a PDF form. So you can basically go onto their archives and flip through every publication from the 1960s onward. And there is no Sputnik magazine from 1962 that talks at all about the Dropa or the Dropa Stones. And would you believe it or not, in 1968, Chariots of the Gods by Erich von Däniken, where the story is supposed to be also presented, it's not in there either. I've read it cover to cover several times. And so I started wondering, okay, how much research did these researchers actually do?
Yeah.
Because if they're telling us that the story is coming out of these publications, yet these publications don't exist, where are they getting this story from?
Right.
And so I wasn't wanting to give up on this story at all. You know, I approach a lot of my subjects with my BS meter in the red and a lot of questions. And usually by the end of my research, my BS meter has been completely shattered and I have even more questions. And so I'm excited to find out, okay, it had to have come from somewhere. So where did it come from?
Right.
So I found a publication from 1964 called UFO Nachrichten, and it's the July edition. This is a periodical publication, like a newspaper, basically. And it's UFO Nachrichten basically translates to the German UFO Bulletin. And I went, aha, maybe this is where the Belgian UFO Bulletin idea came from, because Belgium and Germany both speak the Germanic language. So there would be a crossover.
Right.
And so I started reading this in German, and then I had it translated into English. And it's very interesting because right at the beginning of the article, it talks about this article originated in Vegetarian Universe, but it doesn't give a publication date or an edition. And so again, it's just this name that's being tossed out there. So this is possibly where the idea of it coming from Vegetarian Universe came from. And so you read through the story, it talks about Chipute and his team, it talks about the discovery, it talks about Sung Un Nui and how he translated the disc. And in his translation, it also talks about this group of people that the Dropa interacted with called the Kam Rase. And so these are the Kam Tibetans. And it's interesting that it's in this article. And in this article is also the translation from the disc. And so as the researchers say, you know, they believe a lot of this story isn't real because, number one, Chipute is not a Chinese name. It isn't. Sung Un Nui is not a Chinese name. It isn't. The Beijing Academy of Sciences doesn't exist, okay? And basically, how do you translate glyphic writing from an alien culture without a cipher? I mean, this would be impossible. And it's interesting because when you read Sung Nui's translation, it doesn't read as if it's the translation of an alien language and an alien story. It reads as if it's the translation of the people that witnessed the Dropa crash landing, which is interesting. So the story would have been written in Com Tibetan, which would have looked very alien to these Chinese archaeologists, because Tibetan script, as I showed earlier, and Chinese script are very, very, very different.
Yes.
And so this is what it says. It says, the Dropa came down from the clouds in their winged gliders 10 times before the sunset. The local men, women, and children hid in the caves and eventually learned that this time the Dropa came with peaceful intentions. And this is curious because we're told in the main story online in this documentary that the Dropa crash landed their ship, not gliders. The winged gliders, to me, sounds like they're either exploration vehicles or they're escape pods. And what also is interesting in this translation is that the Dropa came this time with peaceful intentions. And so this implies that they had come before.
Yes.
And I think this might be where Sung Un Nui's translation was, that they had come about 10,000 years ago the first time. So I wasn't going to give up. This was too little information, but it made me realize that these researchers in the documentary had not done thorough research into this subject at all.
Right.
And so here I am venturing into very uncharted territories with this story. And so I kept looking, and I decided to go back to the Sputnik magazine archives, and I found from 1967 the edition where it talks about the Dropa. And the version that I found was in French.
Wow.
And so I had my friend in Canada, he's a French Canadian. His father is an anthropologist as well, and he translated the story for me. And it's interesting because almost verbatim, it tells the exact same story that you find in UFO Nachrichten, except there's some transliteration issues going on with the story. And again, transliteration is when you have this, you hear something in one language and you're trying to transcribe it into your own language.
Yeah.
And so here we have a story that's coming out of China. It's being translated into German, German to English, German to Russian, Russian to French, French to English. All these languages have different syntaxes. What could possibly go wrong? You know, obviously some of the some of the names and some of the, story items aren't going to be the same from story to story to story.
Right.
And one of them is, instead of intermingling and interbreeding with the Com Rase, or the Com Tibetans, in the Sputnik magazine story, it says that they intermingled and interbred with the Ham, Ham, Ham Chinese. Well, in my research, there is no cultural group in China called the Ham or Han. There's the Han, as in the Han dynasty, but there's no cultural group called the Ham or Han. And I believe that the Ham are the Com, because Com and Ham have a very similar pronunciation to them. And so that's the first transliteration that I considered was different. The second was that the story, the translation is slightly different in this version of the story versus the original version from the German magazine. And at the end of the story, the Visiteurs du Cosmos, the visitors from space, basically, it tells the story of the disk ending up in the Soviet Union. And so I believe this is where that story of the Soviet Union doing mineral testing and oscillation testing on the disk comes from. Right. And so what is the translation in this? The translation in this is, the Dropa came down from the clouds in their craft, and 10 times before sunset, the local men, women, and children hid in the caves, and eventually learned this time the Dropa came with peaceful intentions. And so right here, the translation has been changed. Instead of winged gliders, it says craft. Well, craft can either be singular or plural.
Right.
And instead of 10 times the crafts coming down, it now says that 10 times the local villagers hid in the caves. But the one thing that remained between the two translations is that the Dropa came this time with peaceful intentions. And so again, this signifies to me that they had come before. And so I wanted to get into some of that by debunking what these researchers had put together. And by that I mean they're telling, at the end of this documentary, they're basically saying that they don't believe the story to be, legit because of, several reasons. Some of them being that, again, Chipute is not a Chinese name. It isn't. Sungunui is not a Chinese name. It isn't.
Mm-hmm.
The Beijing Academy of Sciences doesn't exist. There's no record of the Dropa people or Dropa stones anywhere. Well, Dropa is a transliteration of Drokpa, and the Drokpa come out of this exact region of China where all this stuff was found in
Right.
far eastern Kham Tibet, which is now central China. And then that the Beijing Academy of Sciences doesn't exist. And there's another book that's involved with this called The Sun Gods in Exile. It's a very difficult book to find. It costs a lot of money online because not a lot were put in print.
Wow.
And it tells the story of a professor in the 1940s who goes into Tibet looking for the Zopa or Dropa people. And I'll get into that story in a second. And at the end of it, again, these researchers say, oh, this story has to be a hoax because in 1998, in 40 Times, which is a famous British UFO magazine, the author admits that he hoaxed the entire story. And so I'm like, okay, I need to find these magazines and actually read these articles and, find out why these researchers in this documentary, are telling this amazing, fantastical story of the Dropa people and the Dropa stones, but then they're concluding that they don't believe it's real. So that's why I said there's transliteration issues. And so again, transliterations are taking sounds heard from one language and transcribed into another.
Right.
And so the Dropa becomes the Drokpa. The Ham Chinese become the Kham Tibetans because there's no cultural group called the Ham Chinese. Chipute is interesting because Chipute is not a Chinese name, but it sounds an awful lot like Shifu.
Makes
And
sense.
Shifu in China means teacher or master. And so as this gentleman was a professor of archaeology and anthropology at the Beijing Academy of Sciences, he would have been known as Shifu or teacher. And Te is a surname. And so I looked up Te, and it says online in the first sentence, Te is a popular transliteration of a popular name, Teochew, which is a Chinese surname. So right there in the research, it says it's a transliterated name. So I believe that Chipute is actually Shifu Te. And then Sung Nui becomes Suang Nuyen, which is a Hao Chinese name, because during the 1930s to the 1950s, there were a lot of Vietnamese Chinese in China. And so I believe that when he translated the disc and kind of got, laughed out of the university, he didn't go to Japan. He fled back to Vietnam. Wow. So this then gets us into the Beijing Academy of Sciences. Well, if you're looking for the Beijing Academy of Sciences today, guess what? It doesn't exist. And why is that? Because in 1949, it was reestablished as the Chinese Academy of Sciences in Beijing. So the Beijing Academy of Sciences becomes the Chinese Academy of Sciences in Beijing. And so this place actually exists. And so this gets us into Sun Gods in Exile. Is it a hoax? It's a very interesting story. And there's a lot of crossover with characters in the story that the researchers say couldn't possibly exist, as well as traditions in this story, which the researchers say, seem a little bit hokey, as well as costuming that people are wearing in the story that they say, it's not believable that this is their costuming because it's from an actual drawing. And so it's interesting because having read this book several times now, I can conclude that most of what's being told in it comes directly out of somebody's direct experience in either both Bhutan and Tibet during the 1940s. However, both of these countries were next to impossible to get into. Yeah. And so you would have had to have been immersed in this culture in order to write a book like this. And so this is what the cover of the book looks like. This is the headmaster and his wife, Hupala and Vishla, which I don't think that's their names. I think their names have been transliterated as well. Yeah. And then the disc on the right is not called the Dropa stone. It's called the Laladoff plate. And so this is a depiction of what the author or the publisher thought that the plate looked like based on the memoirs of Dr. Carl Robin Evans. And so the researchers call him Carol Robin Evans in the documentary, despite the very obvious German spelling of his name, Carl. And so it's interesting because Carl Evans is supposedly a professor of sociology and anthropology from Oxford University in the 1940s.
Oh, wow.
We are told that this man doesn't exist. This is not true. There actually was a man at Oxford University in the 1940s named Carl Evans, and
That's
he was in
crazy.
the
Mm-hmm.
sociology and anthropology department.
Mm-hmm.
So at the beginning of the book, basically the book is his memoirs, his diary of his trip to Tibet, which he shelved until basically his deathbed confession in the 1970s. He gave it to his secretary, a man named David Agamon, and asked David if he would publish his memoirs. And so David, in the foreword, says that he changed a little bit of the story to make it a little bit more interesting because it's coming out of this guy's memoirs and his diary, and he wanted something that people would grab onto. And so there's obviously a little bit of manipulation, in the story. But then the researchers in the documentary, as I said that this author, David Agamon, in 1998 came out to Fortean Times calling the book a hoax, which is interesting. Okay, so Carl Robin Evans meets up with his friend, Professor Laladoff, who's a Polish professor of anthropology, who has just returned from Missouri, India. Now, Missouri, India is on the Tibetan-Indian border, or near the Tibetan-Indian border, high up in the Himalayas. And he claims that he met this nomadic group of people called the Zopa, which is what he called them, and he bought this disc or this plate off of them. And how the plate is described is that there's a sun in the middle, there's a squirrel, there's glyphic writing, there's a yoni or vesica Pisces, more glyphic writing, as we're seeing here, a naked human or humanoid, what looks to be octopuses, but could also be sperm and egg, or could.
Yes.
So that's interesting. And then a lizard or a chameleon, what looks like it. And so both men are fascinated. They're anthropologists, and they think this disc is a fertility disc that's held onto by these nomadic Zopa or Dropa people. And so Evans is excited, and he wants to go find out for himself. And so he books passage to India. He hires a guide and porters to take him through Missouri and up over the Himalayan passes into Tibet. And while he's on the trail, here's the depiction of what's on the disc. While he's on the trail, he comes across a short man who he says is carrying about 6 times his weight, and he flies by him on the trail as he's hiking up to the high altitude passes. And so the skeptics of this story say, well, that's impossible. There's no way that somebody's carrying 6 times their weight and passing, a conditioned hiker on a trail. He then comes to a naked yogi meditating. A yogi is a holy man from India, usually a sadhu or a monk, basically. Yeah. So this guy is meditating in the glacier naked for hours, and Evans is sitting there trying to catch his breath and wondering, how is this man alive? I mean, it's freezing up here. I'm bundled up for the North Pole, and he's naked and meditating. And so skeptics of this story also say this is an impossibility. There's no way that anybody can do this. And so this is the high altitude passes. These are the porters of Nepal. This is, what a naked yogi would look like up in the high reaches of the Himalayas. But we're told that this is an impossibility. There's no way that anybody could carry 6 times their weight or meditate in the glacier. Well, enter Exhibit A and Exhibit B. Exhibit A is this Nepalese Sherpa. This guy's about, 4.5 feet, almost 5 feet tall. He's carrying a refrigerator on his back that is most likely full of Coca-Cola and beer, which would weigh close to 600 or 700 pounds. And he weighs about 135 to 140 pounds.
Wow.
These guys will pass you on the trail barefoot or in flip-flops, chain smoking, and leave you in the dust because they have a component to their blood that allows them to acclimatize very rapidly at high altitudes, which we in the West don't have. Yeah. And so I have just debunked the skeptics saying that this is an impossible feat. And the guy on the right is the famous, the Iceman, Wim Hof.
Yes.
Wim Hof can meditate for hours in glacier water. And so, of course, humans have the ability to do this. And what he has mastered is what they call the Buddhist fire, the Buddhist flame, the internal flame.
Yes.
And we first hear about stories of the internal flame from Captain Cook, because when he circumnavigated Australia, he came across the southern island of Tasmania. Well, Tasmania is located in the South Arctic Ocean, so it's cold down there.
Yeah.
And Captain Cook is bundled up for the South Pole, and the inhabitants of Tasmania were cannibals. They're running around naked, and they don't have the use of fire. They don't have the technology of fire. And so how are they able to survive naked in a subarctic zone? Well, they've mastered the inner fire, the ability to burn their own fat and tissues day in and day out, basically. Anyway, so
wow.
Evans eventually makes it into Lhasa. This is what Lhasa looks like in the early 1940s.
Wow.
He learns a little bit of Tibetan, and then he hires another guide and porters to take him into far eastern Tibet with horses, basically, to find this mysterious group of people known as the Dropa or Drokpa. And so this is prior to China invading Tibet. And so he crosses the Tibet plateau with his porters and his guide, and eventually ends up at the valley of the Dropa. And his guide and his porters abandon him because they're afraid for their life. And so basically, Evans then has to negotiate with the short and statured guards that he comes with peaceful intention. He wishes to learn more about their people, where they come from, their culture, and he would love to meet the headmaster of the village. And so this is a depiction, as you see, this amazing rainbow of the Milky Way high up in the Tibet Plateau. So the headmaster of the village, his name is Shambala or Hupala. I believe his name is Shambala.
Shambala.
There's a transliteration there. Champa is a very popular Tibetan name. And La is like a surname that you put, or not a surname, a title of sir or madam that you would put after a name. So you always see Tashi La or Tenzing La. You always hear this La coming after these words. And then his wife is known as Vijla. Well, I think her name is Yishila. And she's wearing this really bizarre outfit and headdress. And people, basically, the skeptics of this story say that there's no way, these are drawings, there's no way that she's actually wearing this headdress. Well, it's interesting because these are the costumes of the Tibetan men and women during this time. And so the men and women will both wear chubas, which are silk and wool folded, kind of like a gown in a sense, like a bathrobe, but obviously for the altitude and for the cold. And the women will wrap their hair up into these really interesting satellite structures, scaffolding satellite structures, because they'll braid their hair, and then this is how they dry out, the oil and braid their hair, and this is how they will dry it out. And so the woman in the lower right looks very similar to Yishila from the book. And so these costumes are very real and come out of this area during this time. That's crazy. And even more interesting is they end up in Star Wars: The Phantom Menace, because here we have a calm Tibetan Mongolian costuming on the left, and we have Princess or Queen Amidala on the right, wearing almost the identical costume in The Phantom Menace. And so, basically, Evans then is he's introduced to the headmaster and his wife. He's then introduced to a young woman who's his translator and teacher, and her name is Laren, or Laren Law, basically. And so through his broken Tibetan and her broken Tibetan and the Kham language, she teaches him a little bit of the Dropa language. And it's interesting because the Dropa language is a gendered language, as we discussed with Shina. It has a hierarchical structure. There's a child tongue of it, there's a commoner tongue of it, and there's the royal tongue of it. And so eventually he's like, well, I want to learn more. How do I learn more? And so she takes him to the true leader of the village, which is the matriarch. And so it's a matriarchal culture. And the matriarch introduces Evans to one of her noblemen, who is one of the high priests, basically, who agrees to tell Evans the story of the Dropa people and how they ended up in far eastern Tibet. And so the story goes like this. 20,000 to 22,000 years ago, there is a cosmic war amongst the civilizations living in the Sirius star system.
Mm.
The war is ended by one of the inhabited moons being bombarded by what is described as atomic technology. So this is the 1940s. The atom bomb had not been exploded yet in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. So the question is, how did Evans know about atomic technology? But this is what's being described to him by Lorgan Law, not Lauren, his translator, but Lorgan Law, the nobleman, is telling him this story about atomic technology. And so this moon is bombarded, it's destroyed, and it's left as dirt, filth, rubble, and mountains. Where does that sound familiar? Oh, this is where God Savara says he's from. Okay.
That's
so
right.
in the 1930s, 1940s, the Lotus Sutra had not been discovered or translated, for Western cultures at this point. So this overlap between this moon being destroyed and God Savara's story is very, very fascinating. This ends the war. And
Wow.
the scientists of the civilizations band together to create what they call generational sleeper ships, these long cigar-shaped ships about 1 kilometer in length that they can use to span to other star systems to find inhabitable worlds that they can then colonize. And they're generational sleeper ships because obviously they don't have faster than light technology. So they have to basically live in the ship generation after generation after generation, or possibly go into cryostasis for long periods of time. But this
Wow.
is why they're called generation sleeper ships.
Wow.
So around 10,040 BC is
Yes.
where this gets interesting. The Dropa sleeper ship, or generational sleeper ship, arrives in our solar system, discovers our sun and this little tiny blue marble we call Earth, and realize that although the sun in this solar system is smaller than what they're used to around Sirius, the planet of Earth that they have discovered is very similar to one of the planets around the Sirius star system, and therefore is inhabitable. And so they then send down their exploration vehicles to collect mineral samples, mineral samples, water samples, air samples, vegetation. And while they're on the planet, they're attacked by the primitive humans, which are just coming out of the Ice Age, the younger Dryas. And so, we've gone from advanced civilization back to sticks and stones in a sense during this time period. This is also the same time period that Göbekli Tepe in Turkey comes out of, very similar time period. And so the humans attack the Dropa. Some of them are injured. Some of the humans are killed. They are put on the ship and put into cryostasis to be studied once they get back to Sirius as well. Some of the injured Dropa decide to stay behind because they're too frail at this point to make the trip back. And some of the younger Dropa warriors decide they're going to have their ways sexually with the young human women. So they all end up going back to Sirius, obviously a couple generations later. The scientists research what they brought back and start to realize that the humans are genetic cousins of the Dropa. And after reading the mission logs and realizing that there was, fornication going on and some of the Dropa were left behind, they realized that there could be a human Dropa hybrid race living on Earth.
Wow.
And so they dispatch another generational sleeper ship that's smaller and faster to return to Earth. And it arrives here around 1040 AD. So within the last 1,500 years. It gets into the atmosphere and it starts to malfunction. The young warriors revolt against the matriarch hierarchy and the female pilots and the female navigators. And they also realize that the ship is malfunctioning. And so in a last ditch effort, they decide to send back towards Sirius one of their exploration vehicles with an SOS for help. Not sure, when the SOS will be heard, but maybe in a generation or two, they will be rescued. Then the ship starts to decay its orbit. They jettison their weapon systems into the Arctic Ocean and eventually steer toward the northeast and crash into this very remote region of, central China, far eastern Com Tibet. They're not used to the cold, and so they send out exploration parties to find food, water, and shelter. Some of these exploration parties do not come back. These are the people I believe that were buried in the cave, which would make sense because the mummification and the decay seems about right for being about 1,500 to 2,000 years old versus 10,000 years ago. So this is what I believe is in the cave, are the people from this exploration. So eventually the Dropa have to intermix and intermingle with the local Com Tibetan. They take some of the precious metals off their ship and trade for food, for seeds that they can sow in the land, for livestock, for potable water. Eventually they end up marrying and interbreeding with the Com Tibetans and taking on their cultural and religious traits. And this is where we find them today, basically, in a sense.
Wow.
In 1908, another generational ship is seen in orbit, and so the Dropa get incredibly excited. We're going to be rescued. However, this ship stays in orbit for many moons and then disappears. It leaves orbit.
Wow.
And so the Dropa are incredibly, saddened that they weren't rescued, but they learn of an event that happens several hundred kilometers to the north of them in the middle of Siberia, where there was a massive explosion, and this is known as the Tunguska event. And so a small craft or meteorite or whatever exploded above this forested area and flattened about 20 kilometers of forest, completely flat. Oof. From this high altitude explosion. And so my thinking is that this is possibly one of the exploration vehicles coming to look for the Dropa, and something happened to it and it exploded.
Wow.
Evans is perplexed. He doesn't know what to think of this. He realizes that the main temple in the Dropa village is the remains of their ship, and he wants to see the ship. So detractors and skeptics of this story say there's no way that there's a kilometer, or a kilometer long temple in the middle of, this area of Tibet or China. There's no way that there's a monastery there. Well, guess what? There is. There's the Shangri-La Monastery. It's in Com Tibet, and it's 1.2 kilometers long. And so it beggars the question, was there originally a ship in this region? And what also is interesting about this region of Eastern Com Tibet is we have these star forts or star towers that are all arranged in a specific pattern that basically look out over the landscape, and nobody really realizes or knows what these towers were used for. I think they were lookout towers, but I actually have not done the research to see if there is a pattern looking at them from above that is mimicking a star system.
Ooh, you should have done that research and see what comes out of it.
That would be your next project. Is the next phase of the research.
Yeah.
So Lorgan tells Evans, "I'll take you into the ship, and show you, the inside of the ship." And so he enters the ship with Lorgan and says that there's still a hum of electricity pulsing through the ship, even though the ship has been derelict for 1,000 years, 1,500 years. He's shown spools and spools of wires that connect to a box that house a bunch of discs in the box. I believe this to be fiber optic technology, which did not exist in the 40s and did not exist in the 70s. So we're being described fiber optics, and the discs seem very similar to solid state hard drives where they store information. So the fiber optics are supplying information to these hard drives. And Evans has also shown curved flat screen monitors that he was told had the ability to see quite some distance. So while the craft is in space, it can see things that are happening on the planet through the monitors. And the navigators are using what we call tip set gloves. So the tips of the gloves are connected basically to a console, and this is how the ships were piloted. Evans is freaked out. He now knows, oh my God, this is all real. Yeah. I don't know what I'm even hearing here. I'm being told that this group of Tibetans are an extraterrestrial race. I don't know what to do. And so he goes back to his translator, Lauren Law, this young woman, and he explains everything that he learned from Lorgan Law to her. And she's, all excited. Oh, now you know the history of our people. Oh, and by the way, I'm pregnant with your child,
Oh.
because the Dropa were very promiscuous, and they were said to have had many husbands. Many the men had many wives, the women had many husbands, so that they could have as many children as they could to preserve their race. And this is interesting because the Bhutanese are also very promiscuous and have a very similar social structure. So the
Oh.
women will have children from many men, the men will have children from many women. And this is how they preserve the Bhutanese culture. And
Wow.
so this is interesting because this is coming out of a story, again, from the 1940s that's being published in the 1970s. And unless you had immersed yourself in these cultures, you would never know any of this. And so it's incredibly fascinating. So Evans freaks out. He's like, oh God, she's going to give birth to a human, Dropa child. This could be very, very painful because I'm a very tall man and she's a very small woman.
Yeah.
And so in the middle of the night, he packs up some stores, grabs his horse, and on a moonless night, basically flees back to his home in the West, never to talk about this story again.
Wow.
Until it's published from his deathbed confession, basically.
Wow.
So that is the story of Sun Gods in Exile. And so it's interesting that the researchers from the UFO files basically said, oh, this book is completely a hoax. Why? Because in 40 Times, the author in 1998, so this would have been 20 years after David Agamon published this book, he came out to 40 Times, and in a tell-all article, he explained that he hoaxed this story of Sun Gods in Exile, not the whole Dropa story that I've been explaining, just this book, Sun Gods in Exile. So I decided, okay, well, they showed the cover of 40 Times in the documentary. I'm going to go find this. And so there used to be, unfortunately, COVID took it away, but there used to be this amazing bookstore in downtown Portland, Oregon, where I live, called Cameron's Books. And you can find anything like 200-year-old books to present day in this bookstore, including magazines. I mean, this guy had the most amazing collection of antique books. And sadly, when COVID happened, he closed his entire shop.
That's sad. Yes.
But while I was there, I found the 40 Times.
Oh, wow.
And I looked through it high and low to find the article, the tell-all article that David Agamon hoaxed the book. And I couldn't find it, except in the back of the book, edition number 109, in the back of the book is this little tiny side column article that's 122 words, and most of it is it's describing pretty much the back page of the book. And then at the end, it says it is regarded in some quarters as an authentic ancient astronaut event, but it was complete satire. And this comes out of 40 Times number 75. So this is number 109.
Wow.
And so 40 Times number 75, page 57. That's what that says at the bottom. And I'm like, oh, I'm excited. I'm going to go find this 40 Times, because this one we're looking at here, number 109, comes from April of 1998. So number 75 must come from, a few years before. So I looked high and low. I could not find it anywhere. And I found somebody in England that had a copy. And so I bought a copy of 40 Times number 75 so I could find this tell-all article that this was a hoax. And so this is 40 Times number 75. And on page 57,
wow,
little tiny side column is a 79-word, blurb, basically saying that the book was hoaxed. But don't ask me how I know. And the person that wrote that this was a hoax is somebody named David Gamon, not David Agamon. So it's interesting that both of these magazines and both of these side column articles don't really convince me that this is a hoax. There's not enough information here for that. It's somebody's brief little bit of information, not a tell-all article as I was expecting.
Right.
And so I'm not super convinced that this story was a hoax, because, as I said, there's so many things that are going on in this story that somebody in the 40s and somebody in the 70s would not have known about, like the porter carrying, 6 times his weight, the Wim Hof yogi meditating in the snow, all sorts of different
Oh,
events that are
wow.
happening in the story. Even the nomadic Dropa or Zopa people, well, they wouldn't have been nomadic in the 19, I mean, as nomadic as they are now in the 1940s, but in the 1970s, they would have been the Drokpa people that wander through Bhutan, Nepal, Ladakh, all the way up into the Caspian Sea, where their name changes from Dropa to Zopa to Drokpa to Brokpa, the
Wow.
further west
Yeah.
they go.
Yeah.
So where else does this story take us? Well, interestingly, in 2017, on the island of Maui, where I used to live
Mm.
for a little over a year, is the famous observatory on Haleakala. And this is where STI, Star Wars Space Command, all comes out of there. But it's also an observatory because where you're located in Hawaii, there's not a lot of light pollution. And so you can see vastly into, interstellar space in a sense without the light pollution of cities and other structures.
Mm-hmm.
And so in 2017, this interstellar object drifts in and is discovered, and it's called Oumuamua, which in the Hawaiian language means scout from a distant world. And what's interesting about Oumuamua is it's a cigar-shaped,
Oh,
kilometer-long
wow.
object that was discovered spinning end over end, okay, coming past Earth. And so when they discovered this, they tracked it and they watched it slow down as it started coming into perihelion of the sun, which is the sun's gravity,
Mm-hmm.
course correct or change direction, and then speed up to slingshot around the sun into another part of the galaxy. And so what's interesting about it spinning end over end is that would create an artificial gravity if it were occupied internally.
Hmm.
And interestingly, there's a book that came out in the 1970s by Arthur C. Clarke called Rendezvous with Rama. And it talks about a craft very similarly coming across Mars and Earth that's discovered, but it's 40 or 50 kilometers in length. It's
Mm.
also spinning end over end and is creating an artificial gravity. And inside of it is a whole world of, robotic, organic creatures that are coming to life as this object heats up the closer it gets to the sun. But it starts to slow down, change correction to speed up and slingshot around the sun. And so in this story, they're having to go inside of it to discover as much as they can before it gets out of range and they can't get back to Earth, basically. And so it's interesting that Oumuamua is almost the same idea, but in our modern times, and it's a kilometer length. Could this
Wow.
be a Dropa craft, a generational sleeper ship?
Yeah.
Well, a year later, in
Wow.
Astronomy Magazine, of all places, a scientist basically says the interstellar asteroid came from a binary star system. Well,
Whoa.
what is a binary star system?
Serious.
It's
Yeah.
Sirius.
Yes. Yes. Serious.
And so it's said that the cigar-shaped asteroid was slingshotted by the gravitational pull of this binary star system. And
Wow.
so right here, we're being told that this interstellar object came from Sirius. And even more fascinating, in 2021, so just 2 years ago in September, the Chinese government came out and claimed that they're going to be building a mile-long cylindrical sleeper ship in our orbit for space exploration, scientific projects,
Mm-hmm.
interplanetary, and possibly interstellar space. And so it really beggars the question:
Wow.
what did they discover in the 1950s in the Bayan Karaula and Bayan Harshan mountain ranges, and what have they been reverse engineering for the last 50 plus years, 70 years? Yeah.
Right. Wow.
And so that kind of ends my story. There's a lot more actually to this
That's
story,
like
but this
amazing.
this is this is the meat and potatoes of it.
That's a lot of information there, but it's really fascinating, with what you just shared. That's crazy. Now, Hans, you mentioned about the stones earlier, that stone.
Yes.
You talk about Moldavite. Is that you said you're going to elaborate into that? Did you mention that?
So Moldavite is it's what they find when meteors or asteroids explode. They'll find Moldavite glass. And so the Sintamani stone is this famous stone that comes out of Buddhist culture, basically,
Mhm.
that is said to be a piece of Moldavite glass or meteorite. that's come here. There's another meteorite that got sculpted into a Buddha, into the Maitreya Buddha. So one hand is holding the singing bowl and the other hand is touching the earth. And it's made out of iron. It's called the Buddhist Iron Man. And it's interesting because actually I think I have a picture of it in my shameless plug here. My book, Dropa, Legends and Lore.
You're gonna talk about your book afterward, but yeah.
Oh yeah. In here I have a picture of the Buddhist iron. There it is. I don't know.
Oh wow. Okay.
Yeah, so this is it's a statue that's made out of iron, but the iron came from a meteorite, basically. And so it's not uncommon that meteorites are being used for religious artifacts. And so the Sintamani stone itself, being a piece of meteorite that came from Sirius, supposedly 20,000 years ago, is fascinating. And it also has this ability to give people longevity of life and prosperity. And so this is why earlier in the story, I was comparing it to the philosopher's stone, because to alchemists, they're all trying to discover longevity in life through this philosopher's stone. And it's the same story with the meteorite that's in Mecca. I mean, it's a stone that grants luck and longevity of life, basically. And it came from Sirius. And so there's this really intriguing association with Sirius.
So
and all these items.
That there is association with the meteorite, which is Moldavite.
Yeah,
they actually came from Sirius.
This is what we're told. Yes.
Wow.
And this is what I learned through Tashila, and so I'm incredibly fortunate and grateful for his teachings, because he started seeing my interest in the Sirius connection.
Yeah, can I ask you something? You may know.
Yeah, certainly.
It's no accident that I'm hearing you this story, because you heard about Lemuria, right?
Yes.
The civilization. And Lemuria, I mean, but this is just, I didn't read it anywhere, but it's just from my own, I can't tell you, it's like downloads or knowing, that from Hawaii, that location, all the way to Asia, like Tibet and Bhutan or China, even in Southeast Asia, those were all part of Lemuria that was destroyed back then. And that's why there was like ancient healing remedy, like meditations or acupuncture, herbalists and Ayurveda, all that, they came from that. And the original people or the aliens that came into Lemuria to either share the knowledge or
came from Sirius.
Yes, came from Sirius. Yes.
And some of them ended up in the time frame. I don't call it a place, I call it a time of Atlantis.
Yes.
And so the Atlantis connection is very strong with Sirius as well. And so
with Atlantis, I get the Sirius and Palladians and the Anunnaki, but the Lemuria, especially with the Sirius. And that's why, it's
interesting you're talking about Hawaii being part of that, because Lemuria was supposedly, in the Pacific Ocean, but during the last ice age, the Pacific Ocean would have been a lot shallower. And so a lot of the islands that are in the Pacific Ocean would have been connected like mountain ranges. Yeah. And it's fascinating that we're told that there are these massive underground tunnel systems that stretch all the way under Tibet, all the way under China. I mean, this is what Alice Bailey and Nicholas Roerich and Alexandria Neal and Madame Blavatsky, they were all looking for the entrance to the underworld.
That's weird.
They thought it was in Tibet. They thought it could be in Nepal. There's tons of caves in Nepal.
Tons of it.
Underneath.
Now, what's interesting is this is maybe a year ago, I traveled back from Thailand and back to America here, and came across this guy. I didn't know him. We were just waiting for another flight, and he came to me and go, "Hey, it's good to see you." I'm like, thought in my head, I was just like, "Oh yeah." Like, who is this guy? And right away, believe it or not, sat next to me, waiting for the next flight coming back here. He just started sharing me about all this underwater project. He said, the real satellite is not up there. People are looking up there, looking for a space aircraft, UFO, but everything is underneath the ocean. He said
Right.
he was working for some sort of a corporation that they would have all these pipelines underneath the ocean, and there's an entry. And he said that this is secret. I have no idea who this guy was. Never knew. And then after that,
Wow.
he finished conversation, he just walked off.
Interesting.
Yes.
Recently, there's another journalist who interviews a lot of people. He goes by Dark Journalist. His name is Daniel List, and he's been talking about the hot zone, which is this area around Cuba. And so there's a thought that there's an ancient city structure off the coast of Cuba that's about 2,000 feet underwater. And it's fascinating that when you start looking at like the Gemini and Mercury spacecraft that were going up in the late 50s, mid 60s, you would have had a commanding view while orbiting the Earth of structures underneath the ocean.
Yes. Well, it was so funny, Hans. I don't know. I mean, now we're just sharing stuff, and they were trying to put puzzles together. Everybody.
Right.
I get like everything is the portal is underneath the ocean, but it's like how we have you heard the word so above and below.
Right.
So everything that's happening in the ocean is a mirror of. It shows that it's happening up there. So they're pointing us to look up there, but it's really down there underneath.
And this is similar to the Mount Meru experience, because how do you enter the dimensional portal of Mount Meru? You have to enter it through the underground cities.
Whoa.
Through
And I always
through
question that.
Shambala. Yeah. So you are going below to go above.
Yes. And it's like a mirror. And in the physical dimension here, they were showing us everything is above the sky, but in reality is under unconscious, the ocean, the water. And the water is like a large conductor,
Exactly.
And that's where all the minerals and everything underneath the ocean. Yeah.
You can find gold down there. You can find just about everything you need down there. And we're told that a lot of the UFO experience isn't coming from space; it's coming from the inner Earth.
Yes, when this guy shared with me, he actually showed me the picture on his phone, all the pipe on ocean floor, and he said, "Not many people know about this." And he said to me, and I was just like in a hypnotic state, like, what the heck, this guy's telling me all this stuff. I didn't know
That's
him.
fascinating.
We never started conversation about alien UFO. He just came sit down and told me all this stuff, show me the picture of the pipeline. He said it's been going on. It's across the whole world that they built this pipeline satellite. People are looking up in the sky, but it's not in the sky. He said everything is ocean. Look it
all
up.
of our communication stuff is piped through fiber optics under the ocean. I mean, like all of our banking stuff, all of this goes under the ocean through these massive pipelines.
Wow,
that's fascinating.
Now I have to share
if you read it, if you read into the story of Christopher Columbus or Cristobal de Colon, and you actually read his diaries, there's like 2 days on his voyage crossing the Atlantic Ocean where his ship is followed by lights underneath the water.
Whoa, that's fascinating.
And then in Japan, also associated with my Dropa story, it's in my book. There's I'm trying to remember the name. It's called Itsurebune. It's this woman that shows up on the shore of Hokkaido in like the 1400s, I think. And she's wearing an outfit that no one's ever seen before. She doesn't speak any of the Japanese language. And she's carrying this box. And the Japanese call it the box for severed head. But they don't know what's in the box. And then there's glyphic writing around the craft. And they described that it also had like incredibly thick windows. But it's like this egg-shaped craft. It's Itsurebune. Yeah. Let me see if I can find this.
Wow. Well,
and I connected that with the Dropa story. So yeah, please go on.
Okay, you talk about Dropa people. Can I share this story with you? Because it's I kind of put two and two together. Just last week, one of my students, because I'm a metaphysical teacher. She went to Mount Shasta for the very first time. I know you're going there too. I saw one of your bio. This is crazy. I'm gonna share with you. She never been there before, and this girl just start opening up, and she went there and she said, Tina, I don't know what's going on with me. I'm starting seeing all these people. They took me on a tour, she said, and she started seeing being coming from the earth, in the earth. And they said they were happy to see her. That's like a whole family. She said, I saw tons of them. They're like indigenous people. And she said, they were telling her that they are the yellow skin people, yellow orange skin people.
Interesting.
Yes, and she told me that specifically. This is just last week. And this girl never shared with me any kind of all this story. This is the first time she was experienced that. And she go, Tina, who's are the yellow skin people? I just assume it's me, we're Asian. And then she said, then they took her to down there in the earth. She ran to 6 gatekeeper. So I said, that's a Akashic record like that, kept.
Yeah.
She said, I didn't know that. So when you talk about Dropa people, and they were short, she told me they were short people. They were short, and they came to see. And ever since then, she started to feel this being like a monk, the teacher, follow her all day long, showing her how to do healing. She's a massage therapist up in Berkeley. Yes. And they would be showing her. And I have this kind of medical condition, my tummy, since I have COVID. I never share it with her. I never told any of my students. And then I said, why don't you ask this master who follow you since the day you come back to from Mount Shasta? Because she saw a spaceship. For the very first time, she saw tons of them coming down. And Mount Shasta is one of the portal.
I was about to say that it's full of lava tubes, just like Hawaii, and this is said where the Lemurians can enter the inner earth as well.
Yeah, she didn't know all this.
And I'm fascinated. I'm fascinated to go down there. I've never been to Shasta, and so I was going to bring that up, but you brought it up instead. So
that is this was just last week, so I don't think this is an accident. We have our interview rescheduled.
Oh wow!
This happened last week. This is just last week.
One of the speakers at the event I'm going to be at he has a Bhutanese name. He has a Drokpa name. He's not Bhutanese. He studied under a Bhutanese master, but I'm going to be fascinated to meet this guy.
Wow.
I don't remember his name off the top. Yeah, he's one of the speakers there. So I'm like, okay.
Wow. I definitely
there's obviously a reason why I'm coming.
That's true. I mean, there's no accent for anything. There's no accent for this interview because I'm starting to put a lot of puzzle together as I listen to you. And I think a lot of audience will also. This is fascinating. Now, Dan, I know that it's been almost 2 hours. Please share your books that you have,
for sure.
And where can the audience get your book? Because I look up on Amazon. I don't think you have it on Amazon.
I don't have it on Amazon yet. I'm actually going through a business coaching course right now, and I'm learning how to.
So if you can share your book.
Amazon seller. So my first book is called Dropa Legends and Lore: Connecting the Ancient Secrets of Bhutan, China, Nepal, Tibet, and Sirius. I self-published this through lulu.com, so you can find it at lulu.com.
I have your link, so I'm gonna put, guys, it's underneath the description. Okay. Mm-hmm.
My own website is megamyst, megamyst.com, or megalithic.mysteries.com, and there's other interviews of mine there.
Yeah. See this page here? Yeah, can you see that page? I open up your website. So it's called Megamyst. Yeah, Megamyst, guys, megamyst.com. So you can see now these are all your trip, right? Peru, Egypt.
This is I started it as my travel site because I've been studying esoteric knowledge for a while, and so I got to go to Peru after I met with Brien Foerester.
You're very knowledgeable. You're very knowledgeable.
And then I've been to Egypt twice and seen the sites in Egypt twice, and so.
Wow.
The rest of this just deals with, my esoteric research and my books and other things that I've
well, the way you presented
so the second book is called The Magic of Symbols, basically.
Excellent. Talk about symbol. That was excellent. Love to invite you to come back and talk about that too, to share with the audience.
That would be great. Yeah. So if you look up my stuff on lulu.com,
Yes.
you will find both of them, Magic of Symbols and Dropa.
Yeah.
And I also do posts on, like I said, I like to research into movies. And so
Oh God, there's a lot in the movies.
there's a
Yes.
lot going on in movies, and so I have, as you saw in
You
the right
also
column
have
there.
blogs here too, so that's
Yeah,
awesome. Yes.
yeah.
So guys, come up to his site here. You can access and buy the books. You gotta listen to all the symbolism that Hans represented. It's just amazing. And yes, it's all over in the movies. I remember you were presenting your workshop there, and I was like, wow, wow, wow. That's very
Oh, that's
detailed.
right. I did do that in my symbology. I had to combine two lectures together
Yes.
for that. So it
Yes,
was the
you did.
Magic of
It's very
Symbols, and
great.
then it was AI in the movies. But those were
Yes.
supposed to be two separate lectures. So
You
yeah.
did a great lecture, Hans. Very, very detailed, very good. And I know a lot of people can relate to that and really learn from you. So
I
guys,
also do a third workshop, real quick. I teach about ancient Kemet. So Kemet is what Egypt was before the Greeks basically invented their entire history. And so I do a lot of studies into ancient Kemet and the Cometian connection to Polynesia, South, Central, and North America. And there is a huge
oh,
connection. So that's another
ah,
lecture series that I've done, and we could talk about that the next time I'm on.
yes, please. Please. I'm gonna hit you up with that. Definitely gonna have to come back and share your story with that. Just a quick thing, under description, I have Hans' bio, how you're gonna contact him, his books, where you can get it. I'm gonna bring him back for symbolism, and also, the third workshop that he's gonna do, because that's actually I have some connection with Polynesian as well. So that's kind of like, oh my God, I gotta listen to
Interesting.
that. Yes, yes. So, yes, definitely. He's one of the speaker at many of the aliens events and UFO event. Great speakers, and you're gonna be in Mount Shasta this summertime.
I'll be in Mount Shasta from the 17th of July to the 21st. I speak
Okay.
Friday morning. I guess that's the 19th at 9 a.m. I'll be doing my Dropa lecture, basically similar to what we had here. And then I believe it's at 1:30 in the afternoon on Friday. I do my Egypt workshop. And so I'm going to be teaching
Wow, the
people a little
Egypt
bit
workshop
about
would
ancient
be fascinating.
Kemet. So
Yeah, a lot of people have interest in Egypt, that for sure. So yeah, I mean, I'm really amazed with all the information you presented today, Hans. So I want to thank you
I
so
appreciate
much
it.
for being. I'm so glad that we're able to schedule it, and it just made me go wow listening to this whole thing. I'm able
I
to put a lot
appreciate
of pieces. Yes.
I appreciate your time. This
No,
has
I
been
do
great.
appreciate your time. And, if anyone would like to, connect with Hans, for your talk for your channel, definitely you can contact him. His connection will be in my description here. Anyone can contact him for any reason, books and the talk, workshop, all of that.
Excellent. Yeah,
Yeah.
great.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for
Thank,
the talk today. I'm deeply grateful to all this information.
I will say cup and ka. Cup and
How'd
ka.
you know I'm from Thailand? I didn't even mention that to her. That's pretty good.
You did when we first met. Yeah.
Oh
So
yeah, I did, huh? I forgot about that already.
yeah.
I was like thinking to myself, how do you know that I'm from Thailand? But I forgot
I
about that.
love Thailand. I need to go back. It's been a while. So yeah.
Yes, yes, yes. Sounds good. All right, Han, thank you so much.
Thank you so
Guys,
much.
if you like this talk, please do share. Okay, you can message him, contact him if you have any question as well. Subscribe, click like, and that's gonna help, because this is information that most people need to know nowadays. All right, especially those who are fascinated with all this ancient, history, culture, and also, Lemuria. I have a lot of people interested in Lemuria, ancient Egypt, and also the ETs and all that stuff. So thanks a lot.
I'll have to come back after my Lemurian Shasta experience.
Oh my God, yes, please. I think I'm gonna hit you up and come back for definitely I love symbolism that you did. I thought
Okay, excellent.
it's opened up a lot of people's eye. So I think it will. So let's do that, Hans. I'll connect with
Okay.
you. All right, guys. Thank you so
I
much.
appreciate everybody. Thank you so much. And
Thanks.
yeah.
Bye bye, guys.